Hello students, welcome to the channel. From today's video, we will begin the solution series of the reading section of the June 2020 Form C02. We have already done the English, Math and Science section solutions for this test. So over the next couple of videos, we'll solve the reading section. Today we solve passage 1, the literary narrative passage. This passage is adapted from the article Trading Stories by Jhumpa Lahiri. Books and the stories they contained were the only things I felt I was able to possess as a child. Even then, the possession was not literal. My father is a librarian, and perhaps because he believed in collective property, I had almost no books to call my own. Our house was not devoid of things to read, but the offerings felt scant. There were books about China and Russia. My mother owned novels and short stories and stacks of a literary magazine called Desh, but they were in Bengali. I craved a house where books were a solid presence, piled on every surface and cheerfully lining the walls. What I really sought was a better marked trail of my parents' intellectual lives, bound and printed evidence of what had inspired and shaped their minds, a connection via books between them and me. But my parents did not read to me or tell me stories. My father did not read any fiction, and the stories my mother may have loved as a young girl in Calcutta were not passed down. Bengali was my first language, what I spoke and heard at home, but the books of my childhood were in English, and their subjects, for the most part, were either English or American lives. I was aware of a feeling of trespassing. I was aware that I did not belong to the worlds I was reading about, that different food graced our table, that different holidays were celebrated. And yet, when a book was in my possession, this didn't matter. So here, Lahiri is speaking about her childhood as the child of immigrants, and how the books that she read as a child were different from the books that her parents had read growing up, and how there was this sort of disconnect between the environment at home and the environment that she read about in the books that she read. And that disconnect was something that she noticed, but it wasn't something that was too important for her because the idea of reading itself was special. As a young girl, I was afraid to participate in social activities. I was worried about what others might make of me. But when I read, I was free of this worry. I learned what my fictional companions ate and wore, about the toys scattered in their rooms, the vacations they took, the jams their mother stirred on the stove. For me, the act of reading was one of discovery in the most basic sense, the discovery of a culture that was foreign to my parents. When I began to make friends, writing was the vehicle. I did not write alone, but with another student in my class. We would sit together, dreaming up characters and plots, taking turns writing sections of the story. The stories were transparent riffs on what I was reading at the time: families living on prairies, orphaned girls sent off to boarding schools, children with supernatural powers. As I grew into adolescence and beyond, however, my writing shrank. Though the compulsion to invent stories remained, self doubt began to undermine it. What I loved at 7 became by 17 the form of self expression that most intimidated me. At 21, the writer in me was like a fly in the room, alive but insignificant, aimless, something that unsettled me whenever I grew aware of it. So, this describes the process of Lahiri's growth, her transformation from childhood to young adolescence, and how her interest in reading dovetailed into an interest in writing. But this initial interest was more about, just trying to kind of simulate the worlds that she read about, right? Worlds that she did not, for example, intimately know herself, but which she had read about. And then as she grew older, that writing, that awareness of being a writer, while present subliminally in the sense of the needing to invent stories, that awareness of being a writer kind of gave way to self-doubt. After I graduated from college, I moved to Boston and formed a close friendship with a young woman whose father is a poet named Bill Cobbett. I began to visit the Cobbetts' home, which was filled with books and art. I saw the desk where Bill wrote, obscured by manuscripts, letters, and proofs. I saw that the work taking place on the desk was obliged to no one, connected to no institution, that this desk was an island. I spent a summer pecking out sketches and fragments on a typewriter. I began to want to be a writer, secretly at first, exchanging pages with one other person, our pre-scheduled meetings forcing me to sit down and produce something. I worked up the nerve to apply for a formal spot in a creative writing program. When I told my parents that I had been accepted with a fellowship, they neither encouraged nor discouraged me. Like so many aspects of my American life, the idea that one could get a degree in creative writing, that it could be a legitimate course of study, seemed perhaps frivolous to them. So here we discover what happens next, right? There is this pivotal moment that Lahiri speaks about, visiting her friend's house, a friend whose father was a poet, and discovering this space, this writing space that the father used, and feeling that it was an island because it was not connected to anything. It was complete in itself, a place where the writer could sit and write. And this was something that kind of pushed her into rekindling her interest in writing. And she did start writing, and she kind of, met with somebody and shared notes with that person so as to have a regimen. And then she also applied to a creative writing program and was accepted. And to her Bengali parents, to her Indian parents, it might have seemed frivolous, or it at least not, if not frivolous, superficial, because they probably thought that creative writing was not something you studied, right? Studying or getting an education meant something weightier, but they did not discourage her. As a child, I had written to connect with my peers, but when I started writing stories again in my 20s, my parents were the people I was struggling to reach. In 1992, just before starting the writing program, I went to Calcutta with my family. I remember coming back at the end of summer and almost immediately writing the first of the stories I submitted that year in workshop. It was set in the building where my mother had grown up and where I spent much of my time when I was in India. I see now that my impulse to write this story was to prove something to my parents, that I understood in a limited but precise way the world they came from. For much of my life, I wanted to belong to a place, either the one my parents came from or to America. When I became a writer, my desk became home. There was no need for another. I belonged to my work, to my characters. And towards the end, we kind of see a resolution of that conflict that has plagued Lahiri through the passage about calling a place home, right? And, her need to connect with her parents, her need to connect with the place that her parents came from, Calcutta, and how after a visit and before joining the writing program, she submitted a story about that building in which her mother had grown up. And this was in a way this was her way of paying homage to her parents' roots. And then she decided that she learned about herself that, home was not necessarily India or America, but home was her work, her desk, where she could churn out stories about her characters. Okay, question 1. Which of the following events mentioned in the passage occurred last chronologically? The author was accepted into a creative writing program. The author moved to Boston. The author visited the Cobbetts' house. The author went to Calcutta with her family. So this is D, right? We know in the last paragraph that she went to Calcutta and she wrote a story about it. Based on the passage, when the author read books about English and American life, she enjoyed the stories, even though she knew her parents didn't want her to read them. Learning about other cultures, even though she felt like an intruder. She enjoyed the book's plots, but she found the details to be distracting. She enjoyed the characters, but she struggled to imagine their worlds. So this is G. We know that she felt like an intruder. I was aware of a feeling of trespassing. She felt, that she didn't really belong in those worlds. The main function of the 8th paragraph, lines 55 to 64. This one, when I graduated from college, I moved to Boston, and this describes her visit to the Corbett's house. So, outline the writing advice the author received from a Boston poet. Contrast the author's expectations of Boston with her experiences living there. Relate how a friendship influenced the author's commitment to writing. Describe a friend the author met while she was at college. So this is C, right? Because this friendship led her to visit the friend's house. And because the friend's father was a poet, and when she visited the father's working space, that was something that attracted her, that idea of being cocooned in a space and being writing about whatever you wanted. That was something that pushed her to write. When the author says the possession was not literal, she most nearly means that. So here, the first paragraph, she talks about the fact that, she felt that books were the only things she was able to possess as a child. But then the possession was not literal because she didn't really own those books, right? Her father was a librarian and they didn't have, they had books at home, but they didn't possess in the literal sense a lot of books at home. So she nearly means that she read at the library, but her father wouldn't let her borrow books. Had many books in her room, but they belonged to her parents. Read many books, but she owned very few of them. Heard stories from her mother, but she felt that the stories weren't hers, right? So the possession was not literal, is to indicate that she read many books, but she owned very few of them. Based on the passage, when the author was a child, reading books helped her by offering glimpses into the lives of children who lived in India, a reprieve from her anxiety about her peers' opinions of her, something to do while she waited for her parents to come home, a way to learn the stories her mother loved as a child. So during childhood, so I was worried what others might make of me, right? So she was worried about her peers' opinions. And when I read, I was let go of this worry. I was free from this worry. So it was a reprieve from her anxiety about her peers' opinions. Based on the passage, the stories the author wrote as a child can best be described as updated versions of traditional Indian stories, original tales about her school life, slight variations on her father's stories, obvious imitations of the books she was reading. So this is J. It's written very clearly here. The stories were transparent riffs on what I was reading at the time, right? She picked up themes and characters and ideas from those books. In the passage, the author states this desk was an island primarily to support the idea that Cobbett struggled with the isolation caused by his writing career, composed his best poems in solitude, wrote for himself, not out of obligation, insisted on quiet when he was writing. So it's C, right? Because if you look at how she describes the desk, she says, I saw the desk where Bill wrote, obscured by manuscripts, letters, and proofs. I saw that the work taking place on this desk was obliged to no one, connected to no institution, that the desk was an island, right? And it was in fact that aspect of being a writer, of being complete in one space that attracted Lahiri. The passage most strongly suggests that the author believes her parents thought getting a degree in creative writing was a frivolous notion, though they didn't say so. Good opportunity, though they were unfamiliar with the program. Worthwhile pursuit, though they were unsure at first. Waste of time, though they encouraged her. So I think it was frivolous to them, right? That the fact that creative writing could be a legitimate course of study was perhaps frivolous to them. Ninth, the author states that when she started writing stories again in her 20s, her motivation for writing had changed from trying to connect with her peers to trying to live up to her friends' expectations of her, prove to herself that she could succeed, make a connection with her parents, escape from day-to-day life. So this is C, right? She wanted to connect to her parents. I see now that my impulse to write this story was to prove something to my parents, that I understood in a limited way the world they came from. The main idea of the last paragraph is that the author writes about characters who search for a place to belong, has grown accustomed to feeling out of place, feels caught between India and America, has found a sense of belonging in her writing. So it's J, because she says that if I had been looking for a home, the reason I had been looking for a home was because the stories that I read, I was trying to find if I connected to them. And I finally found that the real home was not India or America, but my writing. Okay, so that was the first passage. Let's grade this. Reading question 1 to 10. Give me a second. Yeah. DGCHB, DGCHB, JCFCJ, JCFCJ. Okay, so we got all correct. Hope this exercise was useful. Remember that on ACT, time is of the essence, but do not skim the passage, because I find that when you skim the passage, then you leave out essential details while reading, and those can affect your accuracy. So read the passage properly, because if you do that, you will save a lot of time while answering questions, right? And that is where you save time in answering questions. Subscribe to the channel and hit like if this helped. Do check out the solutions to the other sections of this test and come back later for solutions of the other reading passages. I'll see you guys then. Take care. Bye-bye.